Those early losses in Singapore, the Philippines, and elsewhere turned the Pacific into an ocean of Allied defeats. But on a day in April 1942, 16 B-25s took off from the deck of the carrier Hornet and headed for Tokyo. The Doolittle raid was underway. This is the story of the men who planned and flew that heroic mission. It is told mainly in their words.
My name is Jimmy Doolittle. I'd like to tell you a little about the Tokyo raid. It's difficult to say who first conceived the idea of bombing the Japanese homeland. But as far as I know, the military concept came from then Captain, later Admiral Lowe of the U.S. Navy.
In late January or early February 1942, I had occasion to fly from Washington to Norfolk to look into the readiness of one of our new carriers. And as we took off from the airstrip to return to Washington and was circling to gain altitude, I noticed down below me the outline of a carrier deck. This was not unusual because we had them painted on many landing fields so that young aviators who were going to carriers would learn how small such a deck was. But also making passes or appearing to make passes over this carrier deck were some twin-engine bombers that looked like B-25s or B-26s. Here was born, I would say, the concept of the raid. One might call it fortuitous association, because I never would have thought of it had I not seen the bombers passing over the carrier deck.
One Sunday morning, early in 42, I was asked to come down to the office when Captain Lowe, the operations officer on Admiral King's staff, told me that he and the Admiral had been discussing the possibility of launching Army bombers from carrier decks to hit Japan, and told me that the Admiral wanted me to investigate it and write up a concept of operations. That sounded like rather a large order, but I started in on it, checked over the various types of Army bombers that we might use, and came up with the answer that the B-25 was probably the best bet. Fortunately, the USS Hornet was just finishing her shakedown cruise, was due to come up to Norfolk before departure for the West Coast. When she got to Norfolk, I had made arrangements for a couple of B-25s to be on hand, and we put them aboard the ship and took them to sea and launched them from the Hornet. And the way they jumped off the deck made me feel certain that we wouldn't have any trouble when the time for full load came along.
My connection with the Doolittle story began in Tokyo in 1939. I was assigned as Assistant Naval Attaché and Naval Attaché for Air to the American Embassy, Tokyo. We did not have bombing maps of Japan, and one of my principal tasks was to make these. Amongst my sources of information were the Soviet Naval Attaché at the Soviet Embassy in Azabu, Tokyo, who had a wealth of information available. He used liberal quantities of vodka in an attempt to elicit information from me, but I was able to pour a great many of these into his potted palms without his knowing it. Amongst the other sources we had were sailing in the bay from Yokohama, journeying on American ships from Yokohama to Kobe, and photographing out the ports, the shipyards which we passed en route. We also attended the launchings of all major naval vessels and many of the commercial craft launched from their shipyards as well. At the end of 2 years, we had assembled quite a dossier on Japanese industry. In 1941, I returned to the United States, served in the Division of Naval Intelligence, and was then assigned to the United States ship Hornet.
When Admiral King and General Arnold had settled certain details between themselves, it was decided that Captain Duncan would be the overall coordinator. And in the meantime, General Arnold had appointed Jimmy Doolittle as his man to take charge of the planes.
looking over crews that had had experience in B-25s. The most experienced one was the 17th Bomb Group. They were told that there was a mission to be accomplished. It was a dangerous mission, and how many of them would like to volunteer. The entire group volunteered, and then from that group were selected the people who went. Then the B-25 had to be modified in order to permit it to have the necessary range. The rear turret was taken out. In the tail, 2 false machine guns, little wooden broomsticks were mounted. Extra gas tanks were built. One went in the place where the tail turret had gone. One was a collapsible gasoline tank over the bomb bay, and another one was in the bomb bay, taking up half of the bomb bay space. After these modifications, the B-25 became admirably suited to the purpose for which it was redesigned.
My job in 1942 was to train General Doolittle's pilots to take off from an aircraft carrier within a distance of 300 feet. To begin that job, we laid out distances 200 to 500 feet at a secret airstrip at Eglin Field, Florida. We trained the pilots for light load takeoffs, medium load, and heavy load. All the pilots did exceedingly well in learning the basic techniques of a carrier takeoff.
I made a trip to Pearl Harbor to tell Admiral Nimitz about the operation and to talk to Admiral Halsey. It was done on a basis of Admiral King telling the Commander-in-Chief Pacific that this operation would be conducted. Admiral Halsey made arrangements to come back to the coast, and as soon as I had finished my business at Pearl, I sent a signal back to Washington which said, "Tell Jimmy to get on his horse." That was the signal for Doolittle and company to move to Sacramento.
Finally, the day came when they gave us the order to go to San Francisco. We flew across the United States. It took 3 or 4 days. We did low flying most of the way. We were just skimming the treetops and the fence tops. When we got to San Francisco, there was an order that we were not supposed to fly underneath the Golden Gate Bridge, but that made it all the more interesting for one of the pilots, and he flew his crew right underneath that Golden Gate Bridge.
The arrangements had been made for Doolittle and his flyers to fly into Alameda. They flew in, and as they landed, they taxied right down to the dock and were hoisted aboard the ship. Nobody was permitted to go back ashore. When the airplanes were all on board, they cast off and left the dock. That night, they sailed on this expedition.
On April 13th, 1942, 11 days after her sailing, the Hornet, B-25's lashed to her flight deck, is joined by Task Force 16, which flies the flag of Admiral William Halsey on the carrier Enterprise. The bolstered force pushes westward toward Japan. Doolittle has told Bull Halsey he hopes to launch the strike 450 statute miles from Japan. 550 will be possible. Beyond 650, too far for overfly to China. For the crew, token physical training, memorizing "I am an American" in Chinese, the wrong dialect it later develops, poker, and endless briefings.
During the briefings, I covered the locations of the Japanese industries, locations of anti-aircraft batteries, such wonderful aiming points as the Diet Building Tower and the 3 radio towers near the Navy Ministry in downtown Tokyo. I showed them where the Imperial Palace was and how to avoid that, and in general covered all the escape and evasion tactics which could be used to get in and get out in one piece. I felt that most of the pilots, with the exception of Colonel Doolittle, were far more interested in getting their aircraft off the flight deck of the Hornet than they were in any possible troubles they might encounter over Japan.
We had various worries.
while on the carrier. One is that we might be intercepted by Japanese surface craft or Japanese aircraft. Captain Michener and Admiral Halsey and I had all agreed that if we were intercepted, while still within range of Honolulu, we would clear the carrier decks and fly back to Honolulu. If within range of Midway, we would fly to Midway. If out of range of Midway and not within range of Japan, we would push the aircraft overboard so the carrier decks could be cleared. If within range of Japan, we would go ahead and complete our bombing missions, even though we had to land immediately afterwards and fall into Japanese hands. This was the most serious eventuality that we had to consider.
As soon as we entered Japanese waters, the aircraft were fueled and bombs were loaded. The bombs that went into Colonel Doolittle's aircraft had one addition. He attached to the tail fin of one of the 500-pound bombs a medal which the Japanese had given me in Tokyo in 1940. The morning of April 18th, 1942 dawned clear. A strong wind was blowing and there were heavy seas.
They told us that we only had about 400 more miles to sail. By night, we would take off of the aircraft carrier. But just as someone had told us this, a fishing boat was spotted. And the order came for us to man our airplanes and clear the deck.
We were afraid that the die had been cast and that the word had gotten to Tokyo that we were on our way. The two cruisers which accompanied us opened fire with their 15 6-inch guns, and a veritable volcano of water spouted all around the ship. The little trawler heaved up and down with the waves, and it wasn't until a good many salvos had been fired that she was dispatched.
The worst
Captain Pete Mitcher watches 80 men and 16 planes streak toward Japan. Not 450 miles away, not 550, but because of the trawler, 650 miles away. As his task force withdraws eastward at 25 knots, Halsey sees the planes speed into the west.
As soon as all the aircraft were airborne, I walked up to air plot, turned on the radio to the Japanese broadcast frequency, and sat there with my earphones on. We found out that there was a Japanese air defense exercise being conducted at this time, and I have no doubt whatever that this air defense exercise allowed our aircraft to slip in without exciting the Japanese radar operators.
This fantastic coincidence, a practice air raid drill which will end just before the Doolittle strike at noon, not only will help the planes slip in and get away, but will fool many into believing that the American planes, even the Japanese ack-ack to follow, are all part of the same thing, a mock alert.
Apparently, there was no advanced warning of the raid as we experienced little hostile action. We approached the targets right on the treetops. pulled up to about 1,500 feet and dropped our bomb. 1,500 feet was the lowest altitude from which we could bomb without danger of damaging our own ships with the bomb. We then returned to a low altitude, maneuvered evasively, and went on. We should like to have remained around to see exactly what had happened. This was impossible, as we were in a hurry.
We came in from over in this direction. We were flying around over in that way, and then there was three gas tanks over there. We dropped our bombs on those three gas tanks. I can see them from here. We flew up this way, right up to this place where I'm standing, right over this place. And there's a place over here that we thought was a aircraft factory, but it turned out later to be division headquarters. And they had a depot there, and they had a lot of animals and different things stored here, and there was some hay. So our incendiary bombs dropped on the hay and burned up that hay, made a big fire. And then we flew out over to the west, and there were two gas tanks over there. So we dropped our incendiary bombs near those gas tanks. We missed them. We didn't hit them directly. Then we flew on out to China.
Planes are to home on Chuchao, but cannot. The homing device never arrives, lost in an air crash. Doolittle flyers crash land in East China. One crew in Siberia to be interned by the Russians. One man is killed, 4 drown descending in China. 8 are captured. The rest make it.
My trip over the target was somewhat routine. When we got to China in the middle of the night, we were forced to abandon our airplane. I called my top turret gunner, told him to bail out. He called me back on the interphone and said, "Okay, Lieutenant, thanks a lot for the ride."
It was quite dark and rainy the night we bailed out in China. I landed on the side of a hill in brush and wet grass and spent a rather miserable evening that night. But I stayed in place until it started to get light the next morning. Shortly after I started walking, I came upon some farmers or people working in the rice paddies. And after a while, I got out a notebook and pencil and tried to draw a map. Obviously, a map was something foreign to these people. So I then drew a picture of what I considered a rather clever railroad train. And after making many noises like a choo-choo train, I got several answers, and people pointed in several different directions. This didn't help me very much, so I just started walking down the trail by myself.
In 1942, I was an engineering student en route from Shanghai to Chongqing. My travel was entirely in the hands of the Chinese guerrilla soldiers. During this region, you might call it no man's land. This night, I heard airplane overhead, and the village called an air raid alarm. It was raining, and it was quiet. A short while later, the soldiers brought in the 5 American flyers. That was the Colonel Travis Hoover's crew. From there on, I acted as their interpreter. I did not realize how close and how dangerous it was, because I was told the Japanese soldiers were trailing us only about 10 miles behind us. If I should be caught by them, I know I would be beheaded.
Survivors make their way to Chongqing to be decorated by Madame Chung. Doolittle, spot promoted to Brigadier General, later will receive the Medal of Honor. The raid from Shangri-La, FDR's description, boosts Allied morale tremendously. Although damage to Japan is slight, loss of face is considerable. Meanwhile, 8 captured Doolittle flyers are harshly treated. 3 will be executed after drumhead trials. 1 will die of malnutrition in prison. 4 will remain prisoners under the most severe hardships until war's end 3 years off. The final tally of 80 men who left the Hornet, 71 will survive.
Gentlemen, I propose a toast.
those who gave their all in the success of our mission in 1942, and to those who have since joined them, our fondest memories, sincere appreciation, and gratitude. May they rest in peace.
Those who have gone,